Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Battleship Potemkin from 1925. Now, this is a film that is one of the oldest, for sure, in my collection, and comes from fairly early on in the history of, let's call it modern cinema, pseudo-modern cinema, some of the formative years during which the idea of cinema as an art form started to exist. It's also arguably the first propaganda film ever made, at least the first one that was artistic propaganda. Coming out of the burgeoning Soviet, well, not the Soviet Union, but the what would become post-Tsarist Russia, and eventually become, the Soviet Union and beyond, and how that relates. The art that is herein relates to telling a particular story of political and social structure, and giving a specific spin with an intention of influencing public attitudes. Now, we could talk all day. We could make a whole channel, as I've said many times about many other topics. We could make a whole channel about what is and isn't propaganda. This is very overtly propaganda, I would say. There are much more overt propaganda things, but in the grand scheme of what constitutes propaganda, this is a pretty clear-cut version of that. And that is not... Propaganda should not be treated as necessarily a dirty word. While historically it is often used for not entirely fair powers of persuasion, propaganda does not inherently make something less artistic. And it's just as arguable that the content of much of our modern cinema, while perhaps more subtle, often has a deliberate skew towards telling a certain type of story. And while it may not be influenced by the national politics or something like that, at least in a very direct-handed way, it is still present. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent entirely too much already. So let's talk about this film. It is hard to watch this film and not see it with a modern eye, because it is it defies convention in many ways, and that it is no small part because cinematic convention was not really present at the time. This again is in the early days of cinema, and in a particular zone of national cinema, where before an era of international isolationism, the cross national arts, the influence of arts across national borders was clearly not as strong. So what does that mean for what this is? Well, in some ways it makes it a more, I don't want to say pure, that's not the right word, but an art form that is under less influence. It is, in a way, what would be considered by modern standards to be a form of outsider art, where it is made by people who do not have an understanding of, well, not in modern terms, we would refer to this as outsider art, as somebody who doesn't understand the conventions and standards of the artistic form, and by not complying with the things they don't understand, makes something unique and appreciable in that sense. In this case, we're working with a situation where a lot of those standards are either not available or not present at all. And so seeing what has been done with limited influence at the time is interesting to engage with, even if it doesn't always feel like great cinema. So there are a couple of notable things in this film in terms of its artistic experiments that it's doing. One in particular that it's notable for is its use of montage, where the idea of montage is not unique to cinema, but certainly one that gets exploited much more in cinema versus something like traditional theater. The idea of having interspersed shots over a short period of time, leading you to an understanding of time passing and the progression of events without having to linger and explain every single event that led through it. That is very much a focus in this film, and something that is a lot of time is spent on. By modern standards, we would probably say that this is very montage heavy, to the point of kind of being boring, because the actual story, the actual arc of the story within the film is not very complicated. So use of montage to explain both the events that are happening and the sort of wider influence of those events, and how it influences people to interact with each other and interact with the world they're in, is sort of key to its structure in a way. It's sort of a load-bearing montage, which is something that sounds particularly awful to modern sensibilities, but works relatively well in the context. This is also a silent film, which leads to a whole bunch of other discussions about what you can do or should do with silent film or film without dialogue, because it does have a score. And there were moments in this film I almost wanted there to be no dialogue at all. This being sort of a standard for the silent films of the time. It has shots intercut with title screens or dialogue screens, where it tells you what the characters are saying or summarizes their actions or even introduces people. Because again, the technology for overlaid titles and those sorts of things were rudimentary at best, if they were even possible. So having a generally slow pace that is hampered further by the need to regularly anything that is too complicated to express reasonably well in visual only needs to slow down things further in order to put it on screen in text. There is a lot of this film that, because it is fairly simple, I just wish they had gone further with the visuals and pulled back on the dialogue. I think much of this film, if not the entire thing, could be told with zero dialogue at all. And that is reinforced by some of the really great cinematic qualities that are present in the film. Now, I don't know at what point this film was lost, found, reassembled, and the scans were taken of the film and so on and so forth. And because the technologies at the time, the limitations of the films they had, the cameras they had, and so forth, it's all the more appreciable that when they get something visually impressive out of, what would now be 100-year-old camera and film, it's worth appreciating. And so when I felt like there were moments that they could have gone without the dialogue, it disappointed me a little bit to have the dialogue anyway, because I felt like I had I had 90% of a grasp on what was going on, and the dialogue sort of took me out of it. Now, I'm no stranger to a silent film. This is not new to me, but because the film itself is sort of so steeped in visual metaphor, that really reinforces less of a need for dialogue. The specific words that are being said by given characters are not as important as the emotions they are expressing. And because this is a movie about it's about pride, it's about unity, it's about it's thematically about trying to bring a nation or a group of people into like an idea of a new way to live, an idea of a new way to organize themselves, and to be hopeful in a sense. All because so much of it is a very steeped in strong emotion. I sort of wish they had gone that much further. I don't know how this fits into the context of the time. I'm not a huge cinematic scholar, despite what my extensive talking about the subject would suggest. And so there are things I can identify that are influences even from the time. But it's hard for me to say in context, like, oh, I watched every other film that came out of Russia in the preceding 10 years, so I have an understanding of like where every influence comes from. That's just, for me, not feasible, and probably not feasible for almost anyone. But it's the kind of thing that fascinates me. So with this use of montage and there's a term called the Kuleshov effect, which is this it's originally a cinematic terminology that comes out of sort of earlier in this period, where a viewer takes more out of subsequent shots chained together than they do about an individual shot, and in combination with acting that is not always particularly professional, especially in a from a modern standpoint, but is often over the top to the point of pushing past cheesiness and into just earnest, forceful acting. It all adds up to something that can be really emotionally powerful, even if you don't see eye to eye with what's going on with a story. If you don't agree with certain characters, if you don't agree with the propaganda that's being pushed forth, and even if you recognize just how sort of one-sided the viewpoint can be and how this is meant to influence your opinion and so on and so forth, it's that doesn't take away from its artistic power. There are certain scenes in this film that really drag and are kind of a slog, and there are others that are incredibly iconic to the point of being mimicked, joked about, and like taken seriously for cinematic reasons in the 100 years since, showing up again and again throughout cinema. But throughout, I think there are some basic tenets of what we would consider to be now kind of standard cinematic practice that are worth appreciating as well, especially because, well, I was going to say this is a black and white film. There is one shot or one repeated shot that is not entirely black and white. And I'm actually not sure if that's an edit that happened after in a more modern release, or if it actually released with color at the time that it released 100 years ago. I could be wrong about that. That is the kind of thing, though, that they might have just painted every frame by hand. That is a thing that was done. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. What was I talking about? Oh, some of the cinematic standards and visual appreciation that can be had here is especially in the use of light and darkness, both as for visual clarity and composition, as well as for metaphor. So in painting or other forms of art, it might be referred to as chiaroscuro, but really deliberate and clear use of light, darkness, and tones, both in the framing and capture and the settings that scenes happen in, as well as in the costumes and the individual items in a scene colored certain colors in order to capture a certain visual effect. I could keep meandering about this for a while, but I'm trying to wrap this up because I don't have this movie being kind of all over the place in a traditional cinematic sense. I don't have a really clear vision of how to talk about it, or as clear as usual. So I just want to say that, like, some of this is very, very impressive, not just for the time, but even for now. Apparently, that is due in no small part some of the extensiveness of the sort of sheer size of some of the productions is due to the acting being a combination of I believe it's like the Odessa Theater, the like the actual military, the actual Navy of the time, and like I think it's credited as just like the people of Odessa. So apparently they just got, you know, hundreds, if not thousands. I mean, it is thousands in some scenes, thousands of people from these groups to make these incredible shots, and it's just very impressive. I'm gonna stop meandering too much more and say it's not a great movie by modern standards, but the influences that it has and the impressiveness for the time and even for now, I think makes it worth watching. And given the fact that it's also like barely, it's like not even 70 minutes long, I think, with the credits, it's not gonna take up that much of your time either. It's a really interesting watch, and while it doesn't impact me in some of the ways that I've heard people talk about this film as being like, oh, it's so influential, it's so incredible, I don't get necessarily some of that, but I find it fascinating in an intellectual way. Anyway, wandering off again mentally, so I'll cut it here. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.